everything okay?
Oh yeah. We're playing this piece by Tchaikovsky, his Sixth Symphony and orchestra, and I've heard all these different things about like what it means, and if there were a video I could watch that explained all these things about Tchaikovsky's music and life, like maybe I would be able to understand how to interpret the piece better.
You know, it's really funny that you should say that. I actually did that exact project for my musicology class. Maybe I can show you what I found.
Wow, really? That would be so awesome. I think it would just really help me have a better understanding of the composer and the work. Wow. Is this why musicology is important for performers to study? I never thought about it like that.
So today we're going to be exploring Tchaikovsky's Last Symphony, its critical reception, and how his sexual orientation influenced and continues to influence the criticism and just general reactions that the work has received. There's ample misunderstanding surrounding not only the meaning of the work, like you said, but its significance and the extent to which it had to do with Tchaikovsky's sexual orientation. For too long, critics, listeners, and performers alike have just simply dubbed this solemn work the homosexual tragedy and left it at that, neglecting to consider the many complex elements of the work and of the composer himself, both regarding to and completely separate from his sexuality. To do justice to such a sophisticated work is our mission today. So to do that, we must start with an overview of the work itself. Symphony number 6, or Symphony Pathétique, was also Tchaikovsky's last symphony. It was completed in 1893, and he premiered it a mere 9 days before his death. It was actually the last of his compositions to be premiered during his lifetime. He wrote one more after it, but it was premiered posthumously. It received varied criticism from performers and reviewers alike. So the symphony is a 4-movement work, like most symphonies of its time, and it takes certain risks with the typical symphonic layout. For one, the 5/4 waltz of the second movement is not only metrically unconventional, but out of place in terms of the expected order of movements. The most significant departure from custom, though, is in the finale. Most classical symphonies, as you probably know, end in a triumphant showing of strength, but not this one. In fact, the Pathétique is the only one of Tchaikovsky's symphonies that ends in a minor key. The last movement features a soft chorale in the low brass, slightly reminiscent of a funeral dirge, which can be heard in this recording. Then, to close out the movement, Tchaikovsky gives the low strings a mournful melody in B minor that quietly dies out to niente, nothing. His finale is perhaps the source of many popular theories of the composer committing suicide, despite a complete lack of foundation for any such conclusions to be made. Fellow Russian composer Dmitri Shostakovich has offered great insight into this very subject, lauding Tchaikovsky for his sense of tragedy. Let's take a listen. Has man's conception of tragedy ever been more vividly expressed throughout the centuries than by the Greek tragedians? And yet it has never occurred to anyone to accuse them of pessimism. Tchaikovsky, like the Greek tragedians, was sensitive to the tragedy, the conflict in the development of human life, both personal and social. With the penetration of the true thinker combined with the intuition of the great artist, he sensed the contradictory dialectical path of the development of life, the world, the destiny of the individual, and of mankind as a whole. Nevertheless, Tchaikovsky's music was by no means marked by fatalism, gloom, or faith in a blind fate. His most tragic works are permeated with the spirit of struggle, the striving to overcome the blind elemental forces. Now we turn to a wonderful resource, an article entitled Tchaikovsky's Suicide, Myth and Reality by Alexander Poznansky. This investigation delves into the wild speculation and rumors surrounding Tchaikovsky's death and strives to disprove such theories, and it almost certainly does so, with evident research and ample evidence to back up all of its claims. In it, Poznansky details the primary suicide theory presented by Soviet musicologist Alexandra Orlova, and demonstrates the many faults and implausibilities of her argument. The main points of the article are summarized as follows. The basis of Orlova's presumed motive for Tchaikovsky to be suicidal is that he must have lived in fear of public exposure or legal repercussions for his lifestyle, which is simply not the case. She describes a harsh, intolerant Russian society. This was easily accepted, but it is not in line with the reality of the time period. I won't go too far into it, but Poznansky delves into Russian legislation and criminal punishment, essentially reaching the conclusion that individuals of high positions with influence or connections, such as Tchaikovsky, simply did not face legal proceedings in regards to their homosexual activity. Now back to this idea that Tchaikovsky was deeply discontent with his life, so much so that it would drive him to commit suicide. Not only is there no evidence to support this, but there's actually plenty of testimony to the contrary. There are in fact many excerpts from Tchaikovsky's own writing that demonstrate his state around the time of the composition of the symphony. Let's listen to a couple. On my word of honor, I have never felt such self-satisfaction, such pride, such happiness as in the consciousness that I am really the creator of this beautiful work. There will be much that is novel as regards form in this work. You cannot imagine what joy I feel at the conviction that my day is not yet over, and that I may still accomplish much. Perhaps I may be mistaken, but it does not seem likely. Now let's talk about queer theory for a moment. To start, why is it important that we approach the study of this work and composer in such a way? Take for instance the essay, Should We Retire Tchaikovsky by Simon Karlinski. Spoiler alert, no, we shouldn't. But the essay details the problematic language used in classical musicologists' discussion of the composer and his life and work. Here's what he has to say. No, this is not the time to retire him in his homosexual tragedy symphony, if only because during the past 2 decades, the study of Tchaikovsky's life has been left to people with little sympathy for and even less understanding of what it means to be a homosexual. Classical musicology lacks the sensitive and meaningful consideration of sexual orientation and eroticism as a whole, a fact which is extensively discussed by Susan McClary in her book Feminine Endings, Music, Gender, and Sexuality. She discusses how queer theory is becoming prevalent in the study of popular music, and speculates how and why classical music study lacks such themes. McClary goes on to discuss the eroticism and underlying misogyny in Bizet's Carmen. The second half of the chapter, though, focuses on Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony, and although it is a different work than our focus, the general themes surrounding the composer and critical reception carry through. McClary discussed the concepts and constructions of analysis in both works through the lens of queer theory, but ends her presentation with this imperative point, quote, "This is not to suggest that the piece should be understood only as the narrative of a homosexual male, or even less that what I have presented is the only possible reading from a homosexual viewpoint. The piece has long been admired by listeners of various orientations who hear it as resonating with their own emotional experiences, and there is no reason why that should change. Certainly, the complexities of the composition ought not to be reduced to a single totalizing label. Nor am I implying that one can necessarily detect anything about the writing itself that inadvertently betrays Tchaikovsky's, quote, deviance. Various colleagues have suggested to me that traces of Tchaikovsky's homosexuality might be found in the unusual modulatory progression by thirds underlying this movement. I am not sure how one would go about making such a connection." To put it in simpler terms, McClary is adamant about acknowledging sexuality and queer theory in classical music, but we also have to be careful about assigning too much significance to Tchaikovsky's sexuality. In other words, we should not be, in a way, pigeonholing artists into only creating or participating in work that is directly related to their identity. If we just slap on the label of homosexual tragedy and move on, or if we read into the traces of homosexuality supposedly present in the work, we miss the greater significance. As Shostakovich said, as Tchaikovsky himself said, the composer dealt with issues of life, death, fate, tragedy, and struggle. These are themes that transcend any one identity or group of people. To reduce such a multifaceted and monumental repertoire of works to just a homosexual tragedy or a musical suicide note would be a severe disservice to such an influential composer. After all, as music critic Tom Service puts it, Mahler, Shostakovich, Sibelius, and many others could not have composed the symphonies they did without the example of Tchaikovsky's Sixth. It's just a terrible fluke of fate that this was his last symphony, and not the beginning of what could have been his most exciting creative period as a composer.